Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa sahbihi ajma'in. We welcome everybody, alhamdulillah, to a discussion with Sheikh Salman Nasir on an introduction to Hadith Sciences. We're glad to be hosting, inshallah, these kind of discussions with the Legacy Institute in furthering discussing the different sciences of Islam as well as different topics. And inshallah ta'ala, we will be announcing more of these type of discussions in the future. You can check our website as well as our social media, inshallah, for that. I'll introduce, inshallah, Sheikh Salman Nasir with us. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ahlan wa sahlan. Welcome, Sheikh Salman, to our discussion. I'd first just like to start, this discussion is very important to a lot of people because Hadith obviously is centerfold of Islam, and discussing Hadith sciences as well as, verifying the strength and authenticity of Hadith is something important to every single Muslim. So can you just start us off by, why is this important? Why should people care and care about the Hadith sciences, especially for people who are interested in studying Islam?
Bismillah, alhamdulillah, wa salatu wa salam ala rasulillah wa ba'd. There's really a number of reasons why the Hadith sciences are important. And when we speak about the importance of Hadith sciences, there is a certain level of literacy that every Muslim should have about the Hadith and Hadith sciences and what have you, because the Prophet ﷺ, he told us من روى عني حديثا يرى أنه كذب فهو أحد الكاذبين. Whoever reports a hadith, أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. I don't actually remember the exact law, ironically. But the Prophet ﷺ, he said that whoever reports a hadith from me that he thinks might be false, then he is one of the liars. So this is a very serious matter. It's a very serious issue. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ says, and this is a Hasan hadith, inshallah. There's some weakness in its chains, but it has supporting narrations that render it a Hasan and therefore acceptable hadith. The Prophet ﷺ said, كَفَى بِالْمَرْءِ كَذِبًا أَنْ يُحَدِّثَ بِكُلِّ مَا سَمِعَ. It's enough lying for a person that he should narrate everything that he hears. So first and foremost, each and every Muslim has an obligation to at least have an idea of how to distinguish what is a true hadith of the Prophet ﷺ from what is not. Because as most of you will be aware, unfortunately some Muslims are not aware of this, not every hadith that is reported from the Prophet ﷺ is authentic. Not every hadith that is attributed to the Prophet ﷺ is attributed accurately. Sometimes you even get people forwarding hadiths and saying, "Oh, this is in Sahih Al-Bukhari." So you get these. You probably all have seen these forwards on social media, Facebook, WhatsApp, what have you, where someone will make a flyer and big, long, lovely hadith, and at the end it says reported in Sahih Al-Bukhari. It's not in Sahih Al-Bukhari. It's not in Sahih Al-Bihari. It's not. Maybe it's not even Mawdu'at of Ibn al-Jawzi. It's just Allah Alam where it's coming from. Or it might actually be a hadith that is not in Sahih al-Bukhari, it's somewhere else, and it may or may not be authentic. So people have an obligation to be aware of, what is an authentic hadith, what is not an authentic hadith, and what should I as a Muslim do with regards to, dealing with hadith and quoting hadith or hearing hadith. What is my obligation? That requires a certain degree of what I would call general literacy that every Muslim has to have about the Hadith sciences. And this is a little bit different from, for example, with dealing with the Quran. The Quran is relatively straightforward. The Quran, we have it. We actually have it here. So, the Quran, we have it. This is the Quran. That's it. If it's in here, it's Quran. If it's not in here, it's not Quran. It's pretty, in that sense, it's pretty straightforward. But with the Sunnah, the Prophet ﷺ say, "Oh, this is in the Sunnah." Okay, where is it in the Sunnah? Is it in Sahih Bukhari? Is it in Sahih Muslim? Is it in the Mu'jam of Al-Tabarani? Is it in Musnad al-Firdaus of al-Daylami. I mean, is it in one of the Ajza Hadithiyya? There's so many different collections of hadith that most people won't even know the names of many of these hadith collections. Obviously, many people will know the names of the famous ones, but they don't know the rest of them. So, in terms of just determining what did the Prophet ﷺ say, it is a bit of a complicated task. And so there is a certain degree of literacy that Muslim needs to have. Now, that's not to say that there's not a certain degree of Muslim literacy that every Muslim needs to have about the Quran. There is, but it's in a different fashion. It has to do with there's certain things dealing with how to understand the Quran. But in terms of the Hadith literature, there's also issues related to authenticity. So this is the first aspect. Basically, every Muslim needs to know how to deal with the authenticity of Hadith. Not that every Muslim is going to determine the authenticity of Hadith for himself, but he just needs to have enough idea of the basic concepts and basic fundamental information that he can navigate these discussions and make sense of them. That's the first thing. The second reason why this is so important is when it comes to Hadith and the reliability of Hadith. Now, the Muḥaddithīn the Hadith scholars, have developed a methodology for assessing the reliability of Hadith. And of course, as scholars do in issues of ijtihad, sometimes their ijtihad might differ, but as a whole, they have a clear methodology that they've laid out and they've applied it. And for the large part, the Ummah of Islam and the scholars of Islam throughout the ages have relied on this methodology and relied on the outcomes that scholars have reached on the basis of this methodology. In the modern era, going back the last century to century and a half, there's been a lot of discussion about, well, is that really reliable? And so the questions about reliability of Hadith or doubts about reliability of Hadith have been raised from two aspects. One aspect is, the actual Hadith collections that were made by these collectors who collected these Hadith, Bukhari, Muslim, Abu Dawood, At-Tirmidhi, Imam Malik and Muwatta, so forth. Is the work that they did, was it done in a fashion that is competent? Was it done in a fashion that is reliable? Was it done in a fashion that we can actually look at these as reliable sources? So there's a question about the sources and the transmission of the sources. And are those sources reliable? And then there's a question about assessing the materials that are in these sources, because obviously the work of the Hadith scholars, one angle of it is sort of a historical. This is a historical angle in terms of looking at what has been done in terms of collecting and transmitting the Hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. Obviously, that's something that's already done. Those collections are now in front of us. You can't, get back in a time machine and say, well, maybe it should have been done this way. It's done. But so that's a historical matter, and it's a matter of looking at how reliable are these sources. The second aspect of this is, okay, these materials that we have, assuming that the materials have been preserved and transmitted in a fashion that is competent, how do we assess them? Because we know that these Hadith collections will contain Hadiths that are authentic, Hadiths that are weak, Hadiths, sometimes there are Hadiths that are even fabricated. Some of these Hadiths, there will be difference of opinion even amongst the ulama of Hadith themselves as to whether or not they're authentic. So there's a methodology for assessing those things that the ulama of Hadith have developed. And just so it's clear, this methodology that the ulama of Hadith developed, it's not something that you could say it was revealed in the Quran. Obviously, some principles that underlie this methodology, you will find basis for them in the Quran or in the Sunnah or what have you. For example, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu in ja'akum fasiqun binaba'in fatabayyanu. If, or you who believe, if a person, if a sinful person, a fasiq, comes to you with some news, you should verify it. That's not specifically talking about hadith per se, but obviously the concept is there, but the need of verifying your sources, assessing their reliability. Obviously that idea is there, but when we look at the specifics of what is the methodology that was laid out by the Muḥaddithīn. So for example, we find in the books of Ḥadīth Sciences that they will typically mention that for a hadith to be authentic, it has to meet certain conditions. So typically they will list 5 conditions. Now these 5 conditions, if we look at them, you can't look at them and say, well, these 5 conditions are taken from Surah Shurut al-Hadith al-Sahih. قال الله تعالى الحديث لا يصح إلا إذا كان كذا وكذا. There's no surah that says, oh, the conditions of a Sahih Hadith are these 5 conditions. So where did these conditions? So this methodology is not something that was was revealed. It's not something that is divine. It's a human product. And so that in the last century, the century and a half, there's been a lot of questions that have been raised about, well, was this really reliable? Did the Muḥaddithīn really know what they were doing? Do they over-rely on assessment of the isnad, the chain of narration, and ignore textual criticism, etc., etc.? There are questions also that have been raised about, well, about hadith from another angle, which is what is the legal authority of the sunnah? To what extent does sunnah play a role in legislation and laying out rulings? That's obviously a different discussion. That's more of an usul al-fiqh discussion. There's more to be technical. That's more of an usul al-fiqh discussion. Although obviously it's clearly related to the sunnah. But the question about the reliability of the materials, because then that becomes a question of interpretation. But in terms of the reliability and assessing the reliability of what has been transmitted, that is the domain of the Hadith Sciences. And so because there are all these questions, sometimes Muslims have doubt. Now, as a general answer, I think it's safe to say that a sensible person would say that this ummah, as an ummah, and certainly if one believes that this ummah is guided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that Allah has revealed this religion for this ummah to be the final religion and the final revelation, and that over the course of the centuries that hundreds of scholars, thousands of scholars have participated in the development of the Hadith Sciences, whether in regards to transmission of Hadith, whether in regards to recording Hadith, whether in regards to writing about the theoretical aspect of Hadith methodology, or whether about looking at examining actual Hadiths and assessing their authenticity, and all of these different facets. So generation after generation of scholarship has looked at the Hadith Sciences and participated in them in some fashion or another. Generation after generation of scholars have made this a priority. Consider the fact that the Sunnah is indispensable for understanding the Quran. That's something that there are shubhat about that would need to be dealt with separately. But if one accepts this, that the Sunnah is essential for understanding the Quran, Sunnah is essential for practicing the Quran. So, for example, Allah says, "Waqimus salah." Okay, well, what does that mean? How do we pray? What times do we pray? There's no surah in the Quran that says Surah Al-Salawat Al-Khams. And the time of Fajr begins here, and the time of Fajr and it ends here, and the time of so even the most basic ahkam, the most essential ahkam of the Quran, you need the Sunnah to be able to practice them. When you realize that, and when you realize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised to preserve the Quran and has promised to preserve this religion, and He's made this last religion to be guidance for mankind until Yawm al-Qiyamah, until the Sa'ah, then it goes without saying, one can safely assume that this is something that's pretty important. You have this many people devoting themselves to this task. They must have done a decent job. Even if you don't know the details of how they went about doing that, it's a pretty safe assumption that they must have done a decent job. But what happens is that some people have doubts. They don't know much about the Hadith sciences. And then people start bringing up questions. And they say, well, nobody wrote down Hadith for the first 300 years of Islam. Like, and then this guy from Bukhara in Uzbekistan he just went to the Middle East and wrote down all these hadiths, and he's like, hey, look, this is what the Prophet ﷺ said. And so some people, they hear these things and they have no idea about hadith, and they have no idea about how it was transmitted. They have no idea that, for example, most of the sources from which Imam al-Bukhari is transmitting, although he mentions a chain of narrators, what is in that chain of narrators actually represents, often, for the most part, actual books. That is his chain to the author of the book. So, for example, whenever he quotes a hadith from Muwatta of Imam Malik, he will say, حدثنا القعنبي, one of the students of Imam Malik. So he's transmitting the Muwatta via Al-Qa'nabi. Abdullah ibn Yunus at-Tinisi is he's transmitting the Muwatta of Imam Malik via Abdullah ibn Yunus, Abdullah ibn Yusuf. Imam Muslim is transmitting it via Yahya ibn Yahya at-Tamimi and others, and Imam Ahmad is transmitting hadiths of the Muwatta via Abdurrahman ibn Mahdi, and so on and so forth. So they look at these chains of narration and they're like, oh, this is just like a great big game of Chinese whisper, and nobody wrote down the hadith until this guy Bukhari came around. So obviously this is not reliable, but that's because they have no idea. So when someone comes and they have no idea about hadith, they have no idea about its history, they have no idea about what the actual methodology of Muḥaddithīn is, and then someone throws all these doubts at them, it can shake their confidence in the reliability of the actual literature that was, the actual hadith collections that were made, and also in the methodology that was used to assess the materials in those collections. And so that is the other.
Could we say in essence that this is the Hadith sciences are the mechanism of the preservation of revelation in the form of the prophetic statements? Because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran, "Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikra wa inna lahu lahafidhun," and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala message, "Wa ati'u Allah wa ati'u Rasul," right? So we are the one who sent the revelation, or in this sense, in the reminder, in essence, the revelation, and we're the ones who are going to be tasked to preserve it, or we're going to preserve it. And when Allah says, "Obey Allah and His Messenger," so Hadith sciences, in essence, are the mechanism of preserving this. Could we say that?
Yes.
Could we say that it's also a unique aspect of Muslims, or is it something that is shared among other, I don't know, civilizations might be not a perfect word, but other traditions, or is something that is unique? Some scholars speak about this uniqueness of the Hadith sciences to Islam. What are your thoughts about this?
That's an interesting point. I think Abdullah ibn Mubarak and some others from the Salaf said that one of the unique things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala granted this ummah was the isnad, this tradition of having a chain of transmission that names the authorities from which information is being taken. If you compare that with the books that the Ahlul Kitab have, basically the previous scriptures, the Torah, the various books of the Old Testament, the various books of the New Testament, and you look at what modern scholarship has to say about these books, we really don't know how they were transmitted and who did that, and in some cases they're translations,
right?
Or in some cases even back translations of certain texts from that were translated from Hebrew into Greek, and then the Hebrew was lost, so it was translated back to Hebrew. So there's a good bit of confusion about, okay, well, who did this? Who actually carried out this task? We don't know. There is not any way of verifying how this transmission took place. In a lot of cases, for a number of these books, for many of these books, the actual identity of the authors is in doubt. who actually wrote these.
Right.
And so obviously that's a huge problem. And basically the system of isnad that developed, that was developed by the Muslim scholars was a system that allowed rigorous checking of sources, and so everything has to be sourced. And this is why you have, I think it's Imam Al-Zuhri, or I apologize if I'm mixing up the names, but I think it's Imam Al-Zuhri says that Lola al-Isnad, maybe it's Ibn Sirin. Sorry, I'm really, I'm getting mixed up now. I think it's Ibn Sirin said Lola al-Isnad qala man sha'a ma sha'a. We're not for the Isnad. Anybody, whoever wants could say whatever they want. So, yeah, you know, I think the Prophet said that. which is what happens now with these WhatsApp forwards and stuff like that. It's just, yeah, you know, the Prophet said that. And so the system of Isnad allowed us to say, hold on a second. You can't just attribute something to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. What's your source?
Right.
If you don't have a source, then I'm sorry, we can't accept that. If you have a source, then we'll look at, okay, well, you know, how does this source compare with all the other sources?
Right.
Is this a reliable source?
That you're mentioning, he also, for example, said, you know, this statement of when doubts started to spread about what the Prophet ﷺ actually said, then we said to them, "Sammu rijalakum," right? Name your men. Who were the ones who actually mentioned this?
Obviously, there's a famous quote from Ibn Sirin about this. There are also quotes from Abdullah ibn Abbas, one of the Sahaba, talking about the importance of isnad and sources. He said this was basically in his lifetime that unreliable reports started appearing, and he said, look, you know, it used to be that whenever we would hear anybody narrate anything from the Prophet ﷺ, we would give them our full attention. But now, after people are just narrating willy-nilly, and Allah alam what is reliable and what is not, no, we don't, because it's not all reliable. We have to exercise caution. So, you know, this development came about as a response, and it was a natural response to natural issues that arose. And so that requires having some understanding how it came about, how it developed, what that methodology is. It requires knowing the historical context, and also requires understanding sort of the rational principles that underpin these rules that the Muḥaddithīn have put down. Why these rules aren't haphazard? Obviously, they weren't revealed in the Quran. It's not something that's revelation. So these rules are things that, or this methodology is something that was developed based on responding to need, and and its basis is certain rational principles. And so one of the purposes of studying the Hadith sciences, and again, this is for every Muslim to some degree or another, needs to have needs to have an idea of how the Hadith was preserved, and what is the methodology that the Muḥaddithīn developed, so that they can be confident that this is in fact a sound methodology. And that would require having an understanding of that historical context in which all of this happened, and it would require having an understanding of the rational principles that underlie the Hadith methodology. And so if you don't have that, and you don't have much of a background, then you'll be easily, if exposed to shubuhat, they can easily cause you doubt. If you're exposed to doubts, if you're exposed to these objections, they could shake your trust in the Hadith sciences or in the Hadith literature. And so the solution to that, the most important solution to that is to immunize yourself.
Right.
And the way to immunize yourself is to have a sound foundation in terms of the understanding of the fundamentals. When you understand the fundamentals, both have fundamentals in terms of the historical facts of hadith preservation, as well as the fundamentals in terms of the fundamental principles of the method of the methodology of the Muhaddithīn, that will be an immunization against these doubts. Because when someone makes a specific point, oh, this, Sahih Bukhari is not reliable because it only came to us via fiber optic cables. That's because his student Al-Farabri is the one who is the main transmitter, and so so a specific point like that, you might not know who Al-Farabri is.
Right.
We might even think, what is a Farabr? I mean, don't know. But if you're generally speaking, if you're immunized in the sense that you have a pretty good, solid understanding of these fundamentals, when you hear these things, it'll be in one ear and out the other, because you know this guy's talking nonsense. Because I know the big picture. I know that this cannot be a real issue, because you have an idea of the big picture, and so this piece of information, you're able to put it in context and say, okay, in all of the major fundamentals that I know that this is not a problem. When you don't have that context and you just have that random piece of information, like, oh my God,
anything can shake your faith in that instance.
What is Farabri? And there you go. So that can create doubts for people, but it won't create doubts for you if you have those fundamentals. That's what I mean by immunization.
Right.
You can immunize yourself from these types of questions by knowing the fundamentals. It's not. You don't have to be an expert to achieve that level of immunity to stupidity. Because basically, a lot of these objections are stupid objections,
right?
That completely that they simply rely on taking particular pieces of information.
Right.
And stripping them of any sort of historical context or understanding of the fundamentals. And so then that causes confusion for people. And why does it cause confusion for people? Simply because they're not educated. They're not educated about these basics.
So we discussed the importance of it. I mean, you mentioned obviously Quranic injunction of preserving the mechanism of preserving the revelation was through the hands of man. You're not going to find five conditions of authentic hadith or accepted hadith in the Quran. These were mechanisms by the hands of man. So some people say, for example, how can then we accept such mechanism in light of the preservation of hadith? This is a deeper topic. I know you're going to discuss in your classes, but I think this is one thing a lot of people they send doubt on accepting hadith because of this.
Okay, the obviously I can't give a detailed answer to this question, but basically the way to answer this question would be to actually understand what is the methodology of the Muhaddithīn. What is the way in which the hadith literature was preserved? How is this methodology applied? Given the historical facts, given the methodology that we have in front of us, understanding the principles on which it's based, the question then would be, if there's a problem with this methodology, show me where it is.
Exactly, right.
And that is one of the courses that we're going to be doing, Al-Usus Al-ʿaqliyyah, Al-Usus Al-ʿaqliyyah li ulum Naqd Sunnah Nabawiyya, or the Manhaj Naqd Sunnah Nabawiyya, is basically what are the rational principles underlying the Hadith Sciences. And it's actually a book written by one of my teachers, Sh.Ḥātim Al-ʿAwnī, or really he's my most influential teacher. He's the one who's had the biggest impact on me personally in my studies. It's actually the first book in a series of works that he's writing. The first two works are out, but subsequent works will follow, some of which he's still working on. And Al-Usus Al-ʿaqliyyah, he begins by examining what are the underlying rational principles. And basically the question that he sets out to answer is, can we demonstrate that this framework, this intellectual framework that underlies these sciences, that it is sound, and that it is basically has covered all of its bases. That there's nothing, no important point, methodological point that was missed. And so that's what we'll be taking a look at with Al-Usus Al-ʿaqliyyah. It's actually, as I said, it's intended to be a series of works that look at the Hadith sciences and Hadith, the methodology of the Muḥaddithīn in critiquing Hadith and assessing Hadith. This work lays out some of the most essential basics. This first work. Other subsequent works will go into some more specifics. So and again,
of the book in a little bit, I just wanted to focus on some pre-introductory issues before we get into the book itself.
Sure,
I wanted to ask, so we discussed, okay, the necessity, or at least the necessity for every single Muslim to understand the importance of Hadith and the Hadith sciences at the level of at least having a foundational understanding of how Hadith has been preserved. I mean, that doesn't take too much. It even can be a lecture we maybe can do. The second, thing that I think it's important for us is, okay, so what are the Hadith sciences? What are the sciences that a student of knowledge or a person who wants scholastic literacy? We define scholastic literacy as, any kind of a Muslim that wants to be educated in Islam in the scholastic language, knowing that, scholarship takes maybe a decades, right? But at the same time, Muslims should raise the level of literacy to scholarly understanding. So, and then you have obviously the more serious than that, the seekers of knowledge. First of all, what are the sciences of Hadith, and what are some of the most important things to know about studying the sciences of Hadith? And then the third question, I'll let you segue into it, so I don't have to cut you off again, is what made you be interested in the sciences of Hadith, and what was your journey in studying this? Because I know, for me, knowing you for over 2 decades, I know that before you even started officially studying in the University of Al-Qura, you studied 10 years of reading Hadith and studying the sciences of Hadith prior to that. And then, alhamdulillah, now you're studying masters, almost finished with your dissertation, going into PhD. But just your, first of all, what are the sciences? What's important to know about the sciences for two people, the scholastically literate, educated Muslim and the student of knowledge? And then segueing into what made you interested in it and your own journey in seeking knowledge as well as the Hadith sciences.
Okay, well, if we speak about what I've already discussed, part of that I think would already fall under basically what we could consider ideally what someone who perhaps has no aspirations to specialize in formal study of the Sharia sciences, but still has a desire to be have a high level of functional literacy in understanding them as a layman. He would want to delve into what we'd already discussed about understanding what are the rational foundations and what have you. So this is maybe sort of like a high level ideal for what a layman should have, as opposed to the very basic level is that that layman should actually be aware that yes, Hadith is reliable, and that you should refer to reliable scholars, and what the heck is a Sahih Hadith anyways? What is a Da'if Hadith, and how come because sometimes people who have no idea whatsoever, some of the questions that they have are like, Da'if Hadith? What do you mean? What do you mean? How can a Hadith of the Prophet ﷺ be weak? What are you trying to say about the Prophet ﷺ?
Right.
The one time Sh.Ḥātim Ḥātim was actually mentioning an anecdote that there was a Khatib who every Jum'ah in his khutbah, when doing the khutbah al-Hajjah, and would come to the end and mention وَشَرَّ الْأُمُورِ مُحْدَثَاتُهَا وَكُلُّ مُحْدَثَةٍ بِدْعَةٍ وَكُلُّ بِدْعَةٍ ضَلَالَةٍ.
Right.
And there's the addition that mentions وَكُلُّ ضَلَالَةٍ فِي النَّارِ. And this is a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ.
Right.
He would every week he would say وَزَادَ النِّسَائِيُّ فِي رِوَايَةٍ صَحِيحَةٍ or something along those lines. وَكُلُّ ضَلَالَةٍ فِي النَّارِ. Ḥātim says that one day he was coming out of the masjid, and he overheard someone saying to the person, to his friend next to him, "Man hadha an-nisa'i alladhi yazidu fi hadith an-nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam." Saying, who is this Nisa'i guy who keeps adding things to the hadith of Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? So so now obviously in this case, this is probably not very smart of the Khatib to be saying this, realizing that a lot of people are not going to have any idea what he means by that. But at the same time, it shows that there's just basic facts that you need to know just to be able to understand what is being said, and to understand, to navigate those discussions. That's a bare minimum, and a lot of Muslims are missing that bare minimum. I would even go so far as to say that perhaps, at least on an ummah-wide scale, maybe this varies from community to community. Some might be in a better shape than others, but on an ummah-wide scale, probably the majority of average Muslims don't know. They don't know that bare minimum. And one of the indications of this, one of the biggest indications of this, is that many scholars through the ages, and this is something that has been going on now for this is a tradition that has been going on now for 7-8 centuries, wrote hadiths. They wrote collections about what are known as al-hadith al-mushtahira al-alsin, hadiths that are common in circulation amongst common people. The purpose of this was they're hadiths that people hear and repeat all the time, and they wanted to make dedicated works on these hadiths to identify which of these are actually authentic and which are not, and which are fabricated and which are utterly baseless, meaning they don't even exist in the hadith literature. It's just something that it's just hearsay, basically. So why did they do this? Because they saw that this is a problem, that there are certain hadiths that are always quoted. Seek knowledge even if it's in China. As an example, it's a hadith. Everyone knows this hadith. Many people might not know any hadiths, but they'll know this hadith. As an example, there are other examples like that, and so scholars wrote books concerning these sorts of hadiths that are widely in circulation. People frequently quote them, even though many of them are not reliable. So what they attempted to do was say, okay, these are the ones that are reliable, these are the ones that are not reliable, so stop quoting them. And here are some actual reliable hadiths that actually have the same meaning. Why don't you quote these instead? The thing is, with this genre, what you will find is that through the ages, many scholars have written works of this sort, but many of the same hadiths are being mentioned throughout the centuries. And some of them are still being quoted today, which it's an indication that in terms of general literacy, that really hasn't been achieved. If anything, it's probably dropped in recent centuries. And so the end result of that is that people that this thing that we talked about at the beginning, it's enough lying that a person just quotes whatever he hears. So many Muslims are guilty of it. Maybe they can't be held entirely accountable, because obviously scholars have a job, have their role to play in terms of educating the common Muslim, and perhaps as a group, as a community, we're falling short. Scholars and Tulab al-Ilm are falling short in creating this general level of literacy. So this is like a bare minimum. Then there are things that are, you could call them, tahsiniyat, that once you've got this basic foundation, there's more that you can learn so that you can achieve that immunity that we spoke about. You have a basic idea, you have a good idea of the Hadith sciences, what they are, the various mabahith of the Hadith sciences, the various topics that are covered in the Hadith sciences, a general understanding of them, and a good solid understanding of the fundamentals that underlie them, the historical context in which they developed, so that when you hear discussion, or when a discussion takes place about hadith, or when hadith is quoted, or when you yourself are maybe going to quote a hadith to someone, you know what to do. You know what's being discussed. You can process the information. And when doubts are raised, you are immune to them. So that is an ideal. As for those who are seriously pursuing talab al-ilm, with the goal to specialize in the ulum of the Sharia, or specific ulum of the Sharia, regardless of whether you intend to be a specialist in hadith in particular, or just generally to be a scholar of the Sharia, or a specialist in one of the other areas of the Sharia sciences, then that's a different discussion. Obviously, at that point, if you are a talib ilm, as a bare minimum, you need, and this is not just about the hadith sciences. I would say that this standard applies to any of the sciences, any of the Sharia sciences. Ideally, you need to set your goal that I'm going to learn enough of the hadith sciences such that in the future, for research purposes, anytime a hadith issue comes across my attention, that I have the tools and knowledge of the sources that I can get to the bottom of that issue, even if it requires me going to the most advanced works and researching this issue from every angle. I have enough of a foundation that I can do that. Now, someone might ask, well, I'm not intending on specializing in hadith. I'm going to specialize in fiqh, or I'm going to specialize in aqidah. I don't know anybody would do that, but if that's what they've chosen to do, specializing in aqidah, that's a joke. But specializing in aqidah, or specializing in fiqh, or specializing in whatever he's chosen, or specializing in tafsir, or just generally being, a talib ilm without a particular specialization, he might say, I've studied Naqd al-Fikr, I've studied Nuzhat al-Nadar, or I've studied Tafsir Musallam. I know the basics. Isn't that good enough? I'm not intending to be hadith specialist, so this is not my field. I don't need to go into all these things. I can just rely on hadith scholarship. I mean, maybe if your actual aspirations as talib ilm are just generally to achieve the bare minimum and maybe to graduate, maybe you're not really a talib ilm. Let's just be real. Maybe you're not a talib ilm. So yeah, there's some reassessment that needs to be made there. What exactly are you setting out to do? What is your goal? Because some people, the reality is they come to some of these institutions. If you look at what their actual goal is in terms of what they're trying to achieve academically, their goal is to be a well-read layman. Let's just be upfront about it. That is basically what they're achieving. That they've set out for themselves. I mean, maybe not so much emphasis on the well-read. Unfortunately, this is what happened. That's one thing. Another thing is that, okay, maybe you're serious about, you want to specialize in fiqh or in whatever, and it's natural that anytime you're going to specialize in one area, other areas you don't have the same amount of time for them. This is why I said this is a minimum. This is the minimum. Why do you need this minimum? Well, if you're a specialist in fiqh, if you're researching a fiqh issue, specialists in fiqh don't deal with hadith. And you go through all the above of fiqh and never have to deal with determining the authenticity of hadith.
Right.
I'm not even saying that you need to be able to make the determination yourself.
Right.
You need to be at least able to navigate those discussions. You need to be if you're going to make a conclusion, if you're researching an issue and you're going to make a conclusion, whatever that issue may be, you will need to be able to navigate. You will need to have the tools to navigate it.
So
otherwise,
the exact sciences. You have mustalah al-hadith, which is quoted as like the primary, the terminology of the Muḥaddithīn, and then you have anything from the actual aspect of authentication to Naqd al-Rijal itself, which is a higher and deeper science, and then you have of hadith itself. So you have a lot of people in terms of just trying to assay what they should study. They don't, maybe know exactly based on hearsay which are the sciences, number one, and what should they study within them.
Okay, good. Okay, good. So, basically, obviously, it goes without saying that, when you talk about Hadith sciences, you talk about mustalah. To the point that oftentimes Hadith sciences or ulum al-Hadith is equated with mustalah Hadith. And the reason for that is because a lot of the major Hadith books on Hadith sciences are laid out in a fashion such that they deal heavily with identifying terminology and defining it. Which is, they deal with more than that, but that's a very core part of these books, and it's sort of almost a defining sort of feature of them. And so oftentimes this field is called Mustalah al-Hadith. You have the standard
what's authentic, sahih and hasan, and what's da'if, and how
and mursal and al-mudabbaj and al-mazid fi muttasil al-asanid and other terms that come up. Ziyadat al-thiqa. Obviously, when you study Mustalah al-Hadith in these books, you're actually not just studying mustalahat. There are actually issues that deal with the sort of the theoretical aspects of Hadith criticism that come up in these books. But a lot of it is theoretical. A lot of it is theoretical. In terms of other sort of sub-sciences, if you like, that are particularly important and should be highlighted, you have ilm al-rijal, or if you like specifically al-jarh wa al-ta'dil, which is the critique of narrators, the assessment of narrators, and you have ilm al-ilal, which is looking at basically subtle causes of weakness, or weakness in hadith that is not identified simply by a superficial assessment of the chain of narrators. Chain of narrators is reliable, or seems to be reliable, seems to be authentic, but nonetheless there's a problem with this hadith. It's contradicting other narrations, what have you. And so, those are sort of the major branches of the hadith sciences. And ilm al-ilal is really, it's the pinnacle of the methodology of the Muḥaddithīn in terms of hadith criticism, assessing and analyzing hadiths. When you get into it, you'll find that it's an incredibly remarkable science. One of the amazing things that the Muḥaddithīn succeeded in doing was, particularly the Imams of Hadith and the Imams of Naqd, the Imams of Hadith criticism, one thing that they were able to do was identify in remarkable, meticulous detail all of the different ways in which people make mistakes in Hadith transmission, all of the different reasons that could lead a person to make a mistake. So, for example, there are certain mistakes where you have multiple narrators will actually all make the same mistake. Generally speaking, as a general rule, you would say that if multiple narrators are all, and they're reliable narrators, particularly when we're dealing with reliable narrators who are generally precise in whatever they narrate, if they're all narrating the same thing, that's almost like a definite evidence that this is reliable, because they're all testifying to the same thing, except when it's not. There are cases where, and the reason for that is that, generally speaking, you would look and you'd say that, well, there's no rational reason why they would transmit this in the same fashion, unless they all heard it that way. But there's an exception to that rule. The exception to that rule is something that has come to be known in ilm al-ilal as suluk al-jadda. Suluk al-jadda is when a particular isnad is very well known. So, like, for example, one of the famous isnads is Nafi' an Ibn Umar and an Nabi sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Right? Basically, anytime Malik and Nafi' and Ibn Umar, Silsilat al-Dhahab is called. Anytime you hear Malik and Nafi', you expect the next thing is going to be Ibn Umar. Malik al-Nafi' and Ibn Umar, Malik al-Nafi' and Ibn Umar, Malik al-Nafi' and Ibn Umar. Sometimes what can happen is if Nafi' is narrating from someone else, and it's an obscure isnad, it's not an isnad that rolls off the tongue, basically, you would say. It's natural, whether in oral narration or in writing down the isnad, you're looking at the copy and you're writing Malik from Nafi', and because you're so used to writing Malik from Nafi' from Ibn Umar, you just write Malik from Nafi' from Ibn Umar. It's actually Malik from Nafi' from somebody else. And this is a mistake where it's actually possible that same people by coincidence, that different people by coincidence could make the same mistake.
Right.
These sorts of very precise observations about the nature of mistakes in narration, nature of mistakes in copying from a book, the nature of mistakes that can be caused by any number of different causes, under any number of different circumstances. They had remarkable mastery of these things. This is really what ilm al-ilal is about. Now, there are certain types of criticism that are perhaps easier to understand. Like, for example, here's a group of reliable narrators who are narrating one way, and then an unreliable narrator is narrating the same hadith and he's contradicting them. Or sorry, another reliable narrator, but he's alone and he's contradicting them. You have, 10 reliable narrators are narrating one way, and then you have one guy narrating the other way. Here it's pretty obvious. Yeah, this guy might be reliable, but he made a mistake. He's human. He made a mistake. So in some cases it might be obvious. I mean, once the information is in front of you, it's obvious. It's obvious. I mean, if you don't know about the other 10 narrations, it's not quite as obvious. But if you have the information in front of you, it's obvious. That's not as subtle. But something like Suluk al-Jad, that's very subtle. Not everyone is going to pick up on it. You have to have, a remarkable degree of experience at pointing out these peculiarities. And this is why the Muhaddithīn would frequently, when they would talk about ilm al-ilal, they would say that our judgment on these hadiths, that they're ma'lul, that they have some sort of hidden defect, the ignorant people, to them it's like fortune telling. It's like soothsaying, that I'm just I'm looking in my crystal ball and saying this hadith is weak, because they don't actually understand all of the details that go into the critique. They don't understand the experience that goes into that critique. And this is also why they made another analogy that they would make is with the sayrafi, the money changer, that he can identify the false gold coins from the real ones, the false silver coins from the real ones, the ones that are mixed. He can identify them, even though they might look to the naked eye, to the untrained eye, they look exactly the same.
Right.
But he knows the ins and outs of how these coins are made, and also how they're counterfeited.
Right.
And so when he sees it, he recognizes it. The person who doesn't have that experience.
This leads me to then ask, okay, so first I wanted to hear for what made you so interested in hadith? Because I know you studied, you went and read hadith for like 10 years before you even went to Mecca to study in Al-Quran, then go on to study with Sh.Ḥātim. But what was it that interested you, and what was your path in seeking knowledge, you personally?
Okay, that's an interesting question. It's a bit of a complicated story, but I'll try and focus on the major points so that I don't go on forever. When I originally started becoming interested in this, in the subject of hadith, I came at it from a very particular angle. Now, I had a firm belief that that we as Muslims, we have to follow the Quran and Sunnah. that it's our obligation to put Islam into practice. And I had faith that clearly, over the last 1400 years, the Ummah must have done the job in terms of the reliability of Hadith and making sure that it was transmitted in a fashion that was reliable. Not that I knew much about the details of how that transmission took place, not that I knew much of the details of how that the Hadith criticism takes place. Like, for example, I knew that I think maybe I'd learned this from a Sunday school teacher or something, or maybe I'd read it somewhere, that Hadith has these 5 conditions, famous 5 conditions that anyone who's read about Musal Hadith will have come across them. I knew they had these 5 conditions, but I was like, okay, some of these conditions I don't really know what they are. Like, what is hidden defect? I don't know. Then there are other things. I was like, okay, that the person should be of good character and precise. Like, that makes sense. But how do I know that he's of good character? How do I know that he's precise? How did more specifically, how did the Muḥaddithīn know that he's of good character and that he's precise?
Right. And
so therefore a reliable narrator. How do they make these determinations? Like, how did that work? Right. And I knew that I don't know the answers to that question. Why was this such a pressing question for me? For me, at that stage in my life, this is, say, when I was in high school. Basically, I was coming from a background.
Right.
I'm from the US.
I know in high school you cared about Ḥadīth Sciences and what are the conditions of.
Well, I'll explain. I'll explain how this happened. Explain how this happened. By this point, I was fairly practicing and reading about Islam and reading reading Hadith, Sahih Bukhari, the Tafsir of Mawdudi, other things that were available to me. I was reading them. A little bit about the basics of fiqh, because I was curious about these things, so I was reading them.
Okay.
And so two major sort of questions came up for me. One was,
this is in Alabama, by the way, or where is it?
Yes, this is in Alabama. I'm
okay,
basically born and raised in Alabama. So, and part of that was also because I was in a fairly isolated sort of place. There wasn't really a local scholar. For most of my life growing up, we didn't really have a proper imam at the masjid. It was basically just volunteers giving the khutbahs and stuff like that. And
if you like to read, that's kind of what set it up.
So I didn't have necessarily access to a lot of things. I didn't have people I could go to and get ready answers to my questions. So at this stage in my life, 2 big questions arose as I was starting to read about Islam, trying to read it a little bit more in depth. One question, which is not related to our discussion, was, okay, Islam is pretty big about this whole riba thing.
Okay. Interest. Okay.
I believe in this. Yes, that that usury interest, that this is haram. I believe in the Quran. I believe in Islam. I believe that this is right, and this must be for hikmah. I also know enough to know that the entire world runs on this system.
Right.
So I was like, so what would a riba-free economy look like? How would it work? Not that I have at this point in my life a detailed understanding of how a riba-based economy works. I'm just a kid, but I have an idea that that this is how things work. And we studied economics in high school, and so even before we studied economics, this question was on my mind. And so that was one thing I wanted to get to the bottom of. How would an Islamic economic system work? At that point in time, I didn't even know that there was a field called Islamic economics or Islamic finance or any of these things. I was in Alabama, so didn't have exposure to these things. I started becoming exposed to them later on. The other question that I had, and this was particularly coming from the specific background that I was coming from, was that I'm of Pakistani background, born and raised in the US, Pakistani background. And typically, if you look at the Pakistani community, Pakistanis who have come to the United States, the majority of them tend to be from sort of an upper middle class sort of background or upper class background, with good Western education. And this class of society in Pakistan tends to have widespread in this segment of society a considerable degree of hadith skepticism.
Right.
So growing up, I was surrounded by this, and I don't necessarily mean in my immediate family, but in my community, these sorts of questions would come up a lot, and I was around a lot of people who had these sorts of questions, or had doubts, I should say, and so I was confident that these guys have to be wrong, because I mean, we had 1400 years and all these scholars. I mean, surely the entire ummah couldn't have been sleeping. They must have done the job in terms of preserving sunnah, because this is Allah's wisdom dictates that this must have happened.
Right.
So I had this general answer, and I was confident of that this is a good answer, but that's not really a response. That's not really a solution to this widespread confusion. So I thought I felt I have to get to the bottom of this. So I started reading whatever I could get my hands on in English related to the Hadith Sciences. So I read some basic works that introduced the Hadith Sciences. There's a manual by Suhaib Hassan, for example, that many from back in the day will probably be familiar with. It's basically like an adapted English, like summarized Naqd al-Fikr.
Right.
Then of the most important things that I read at that stage in my life were the works of Muhammad Mustafa Al-A'zami. He has a big book and a smaller book on the Hadith literature.
Hadith literature and Hadith literature in general.
Yeah, so he explored certain questions of how did the early Hadith literature develop. And so I started reading whatever I could in English. Then when I was in high school, my last year of high school, I had the opportunity to start learning Arabic. And over time, I started taking this pretty seriously. Over course of a few years, I started to become proficient in learning Arabic, which is a whole discussion in itself, but just bypass that. So over the course of about 3 years or so, I would say it took me to, while I was in high school and then during university, I started becoming proficient in reading. And then after about 3 years, I started actually reading independently, meaning no longer was I just going in a circle with the Medina books and other books. I was now actually reading. Pick up a book and start reading on my own. Not, gosh, I don't know what this means. Which is a bit of a challenge when you're learning a language for the first point, getting to the point where you can independently read. So it took me about 3 years. I got to the point where I could independently read. When I got to the point that I could independently read, I wouldn't say that I was reading entirely about Hadith, but my main focus was reading about Hadith. So I think the first few books that I read in Arabic were 2 books by Shaykh Al-Albani. And my interest in Shaykh Al-Albani was because of his work as a Hadith scholar. In fact, my interest in Shaykh Al-Albani and in Salafiyya, quote unquote, started actually because of Shaykh Al-Albani and his working on Hadith. Because up until this point, I didn't know that there's famous Hadith scholars in our time or anything like that. So when I heard that there is one, that piqued my interest, and that led me to become influenced by the Salafi Dawah. Start reading Shaykh Al-Albani's books, a few which I read in English. So then when I started reading in Arabic, the first 3 books that I read, and I don't remember the order, but the first 3 books that I read were 2 books by Shaykh Al-Albani and Al-Ba'ith Al-Hadith, which is Shaykh Ahmed Shakir's ta'liq on Ibn Kathir's manual on Hadith Sciences, which he summarized from the famous work of Ibn Salah. And so that was how I started. These were the first 3 books that I read, and all of them were driven by interest in the Hadith Sciences.
Right.
Either in this case, one was a manual in the Hadith Sciences, and the other 2, my interest in them was mainly because of Shaykh Al-Albani being a specialist in Hadith. The 4th book that I read was actually about Usul al-Tafsir. But from that point on, the bulk of my reading for the next few years was about Hadith. And so I started reading, the fundamental works of Hadith, everything that I could get my hands on concerning Hadith. That was before Shamila. the very first start of books being put on the internet was actually as Word files.
Word files, I remember, yeah.
Files.
Documents.
So I started downloading these books,
Right.
and printing them out and reading them. And a number of the works of Sh.Ḥātim, the first time I read them, I actually read them as Word files that were full of typos, but alhamdulillah. So I started reading about the Hadith Sciences. I'm reading, some of the famous works of the Hadith Sciences. And basically the way that I approached my study of the Hadith Sciences was that I had these fundamental questions. I wanted to understand, is this methodology sound methodology? I wanted to understand it for myself. I didn't want somebody else to tell me that it is. I wanted to see it for myself, that it is, in fact, a sound methodology. And I wanted to be able to defend that point.
Right.
So for me, the way that I studied Sciences of Hadith, and I think this is actually an important point. The way that we study and the motives of why we study and our objectives in study play a very important role in the way that we study and what we achieve from our studies. I think a lot of times for a lot of Tullab al-Ilm, when they start studying the Hadith Sciences, they say, well, I'm memorizing Bayquniyah.
Right.
It's like, okay, why are you memorizing Bayquniyah? And so oftentimes the answer will be, I'm memorizing Bayquniyah because I need to memorize Bayquniyah so I can go on to Naqd al-Fiqh by Ibn Hajar.
Right.
And okay, so if somebody's at the Naqd al-Fiqh stage,
and have an argument about
if he's at the Naqd al-Fiqh stage, you say, I'm memorizing Naqd al-Fiqh. Okay, why are you memorizing Naqd al-Fiqh? Because I need to memorize Naqd al-Fiqh so that I can memorize Al-Fiyat al-Iraqi. Or maybe I'm in the stage of debating whether I want to memorize Al-Fiyat al-Iraqi or Al-Fiyat al-Suyuti.
Right, exactly.
And so if somebody's memorizing Al-Fiyat al-Iraqi and you ask them, why are you memorizing Al-Fiyat al-Iraqi? Because I want to be a Muḥaddith. So I'm memorizing Al-Fiyat al-Iraqi. And so then if he's memorized Al-Fiyat al-Iraqi, he's like, well, what now? Like, and maybe the answer is, well, I'm a Muḥaddith, here I am. And so that's, I'm not making light of people doing these things and studying these works. These are very important works. Al-Bayquniyah is not that important a work, but the rest of them are very important works. They're fundamental works. You can't go without studying them. But if your objective is, I just want to finish this so that I can get to the next stage, your objective is wrong. Your objective is wrong. For me personally, when and remind me to come back to the point about hifz as well. For me personally, when I was reading, my objective was, for example, I started reading Al-Ba'ith Al-Hadith. The first major topic in Al-Ba'ith Al-Hadith is these are the 5 conditions of Sahih Hadith.
Right.
And so for me, immediately one of the questions I had was, okay, where did these 5 conditions come from? Like, I know that there's these 5 conditions and everybody mentions them.
Right.
But who actually said that they're 5?
Right.
I mean, it's a basic question. It's a basic question, but I mean, I want to know where did it actually come from? Because if I'm going to defend it, I have to understand who the heck came up with it in the first place.
Right.
So one of the first questions I had was, well, where did it come from? Why is it these 5? Are these 5, in fact, satisfactory?
Right.
And on top of that, well, what do they mean anyways?
Right.
And how do they work? So for me, I set off everything that I'm reading. I'm trying my best to understand it. Some things are not very clear, like what is an illah? Took me a while to figure out what in the world is an illah. Like, I understand the meaning of the words that are written here on the page. I don't understand what that actually means.
Right.
Like, it's a hidden defect. I understand the meaning of the word hidden. I understand the meaning of the word defect. I understand what a weak hadith is. But what is a hidden defect? I still don't know. So, there are things. Then later on, I discovered, okay, even some of the things that seemed fairly straightforward at first, like ittisal, the sanad should be connected. I'm like, yeah, that's pretty straightforward. And then afterwards, I find out, oh, actually, it's not that straightforward at all. And then there's this big controversy about supposedly Imam Al-Bukhari had his own standard for ittisal, and Muslim had his own standard for ittisal. So as I'm reading, it's raising all of these questions. And these questions are coming back to my fundamental questions about what is the hadith methodology, how does it work, what is that, the historical development of this literature, how reliable was that process of transmission, what is that methodology of assessing the transmission. These questions are now leading me to further questions. Right. And those further questions are leading me to read. So this for me was a very different approach from simply a straightforward, oh, I need to do Nukhbat al-Fikr so that I can do Al-Fiqh al-Iraqi so I can be a muhaddith. I wasn't even thinking about, oh, I want to be a muhaddith, I want to be a hadith scholar. And I should even be clear. I don't consider myself a specialist in hadith. And I'm not saying this out of some sort of false humility. I'm not a specialist in hadith. If you want to talk about what actually makes a person a specialist in hadith, I can sort of explain what that is and explain to you why I'm not one. I'm not trying to be humble here. No, this is reality. I'm not a specialist in hadith. When I learned the fundamentals of hadith, I tried to learn them in pretty good detail, and I tried to make sure that I'd understood them well. Okay, so when I was going about this, each question is leading to further questions. So then I'm investigating that. Then so on the issue of, for example, what the condition of ittisal sanad, having a connected chain. I found out about this controversy. Then I found out that there are books that have been written about this, contemporary books that have been written about it, and classical works that have been written about it. So I went and I found them, and I read them, and I tried to decide for myself who was right, Bukhari or Muslim. Which, plot twist, they actually agree with one another. So they're not agree. But that's another issue.
Right.
But for a lot, but at one point there was a point at which I had read everything that I get my hands on this issue,
right,
and I'd spent a long time thinking about it and contemplating it for myself, and I thought I have this figured out.
Right.
Then I read a book by Sh.Ḥātim Al-Muḥaddithīn. I realized I don't know anything. I got it completely wrong. Even some obvious big gaping holes in my reasoning, I didn't see them. This is very different from, oh, I'm going to memorize this text so that I can move on and memorize this text. You will never engage those issues with that type of depth.
Right.
With that type of deep intellectual engagement. And that really is the key to mastering anything. If you want to be a talib ilm, you want to master whatever it is you're doing.
Right.
This brings us back to the point about hifz. When I started studying these things, I was not, going about it in the conventional way. I didn't become a talib ilm in the conventional way, at least not in the beginning. That, I've joined a university, or I'm now sitting in a halaqah with a sheikh, and we're going to study this method and this method and this method, and right. I'm consulting my fellow tulab al-ilm. Or should I read Bayquniya first, or should I read Nukhbat al-Fikr first, or should I memorize Al-Fiqh al-Iraqi or Al-Fiqh? So I had no idea about any of the conventions of talab al-ilm.
Right.
I had no idea about them. So I'd been reading for, say, like a year or two already in fairly, I don't want to say depth, because this is still just the first year or two, but for what couldn't be done in a year or two, I've been doing it pretty in depth, and trying to really get to the bottom of things and reading a lot.
Right.
So it had already been 2 years of pretty serious study, although obviously this is on the balance with my university. Although eventually I ended up sort of ignoring university and doing more of this, which when my parents see this, they probably already know this. So it's fine. But they're probably not very happy about that. But alhamdulillah, I managed to I still finished university. But this really reached a point where this became something that this was my main focus. There was a period in time when I would wake up in the morning at Fajr, and I would start reading, and I would stop to pray and eat and what have you, and but otherwise I would spend all my time reading, just on whatever I could get my hands on related to hadith. That was the bulk of my reading in that period. So it had been a year or two I'd been studying when, for the first time, a sheikh told me. I asked some sheikh for advice about, I'm trying to, go further in my talab al-ilm and what have you. What should I do? Because I'm still pretty at a pretty early stage in my studies, and I don't really know what to do. And so he said that you should memorize these mutun, and he might have mentioned a few things. I don't remember now the details of what he mentioned.
Right.
But the first time he said that, I thought, this is hyperbole. By memorizing, surely he means that you really need to master this text.
Right.
You really need to master it. You need to know it inside out. I didn't think that he meant you need to actually memorize it.
Right.
Because the first time he mentioned that, I was like, is this real?
Right.
Like, people actually do. So the first time that I was exposed to the idea, I was kind of shocked by it. I was like, well, I have all these questions that I'm trying to get the answers for. Why would I spend my time memorizing this text? How does that help me answer my question? And one thing that benefited me in that was that because I'd had, I'd gone to pretty good schools and had I would say, pretty decent education, I already knew how to study. And so I just went about doing it on my own at this stage in my life. I was more or less doing it on my own, and I was reading the fundamental works, and then I was investigating the issues that I had. And and I think that worked well for me. And over time, basically what I found was, at some points I even said, everybody says this, and although I'm going to do this, maybe I should memorize a method. And then I would start trying to do it. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that memorizing a method is something that, if someone does it, that, they've done something bad or something like that. You can learn by memorizing a method. You can retain information by memorizing a method. You can master a science not simply by memorizing a method, but if you memorize the method and then you study the method at a deep level, and then you read deeply in that science, you can master the science. But what I realized along the way was that while this is part of sort of the traditional pattern that is followed, the traditional sort of path that is taken for studying Sharia sciences, whether Hadith sciences or other sciences, started to realize that as a pedagogical model, the idea of memorizing texts and then reading commentaries on those texts, I realized that this is not a very effective learning method. And the reason is that, I mean, just to compare with my own experience that I just described with about reading the Hadith sciences, practically you only have so much energy. On a given day, you have so much energy, mental energy, after which you will be exhausted. And so when you study a matan, particularly some of the mutun of the post-classical era, and this varies from science to science, and you see this also with manzumat, because manzumat in particular, poetic mutun that are in rhymed meter, and so they're basically on the pattern of poetry, are particularly written for the purpose of memorization. And we have other mutun from the post-classical era. Sometimes their language is very difficult. So the bulk of your energy then goes into memorizing the text and deciphering it. When I say deciphering it, I mean, what in the heck does this mean? So you go through and you spend a lot of time and energy on word by word. I don't know what this is saying. I need to just figure out what this is saying. And so what happens is you spend a lot of energy on just what is the author saying.
Right.
Whereas if you read a more straightforward text, or straightforward textbook, like some of the earlier texts, you read it, it's like, yeah, I know what he's saying, because it's written in Arabic, and alhamdulillah, now I'm able to read the Arabic language, so I know what it's saying. It's written in language I understand, so I understand what he's saying. But what is beyond that? What is underlying it? What's the reason underneath it? Sort of going into the depths, reading between the lines, you're able to then focus your energy on that.
Right.
And so that is actually much more effective. The other thing is that one of the questions that people ask is, well, what about recall? You need to have this information, be able to recall it. And the thing is that if you've really understood something and understood it deeply, you'll recall it.
Of course.
You'll recall it. if you just consider, in the Western world, for example, you have physicists and engineers and all of these other
physics.
these are specialties. Like, they don't go around saying, "Oh, I memorized Alfiyat al-Handasa and I memorized, and so therefore I'm a sheikh in engineering."
Right.
You don't go around, and that doesn't mean that they don't know their stuff. And that doesn't mean that they don't have pieces of information that at some point or another they had to memorize it. They had to be able to have it on instant recall that they can verbatim spit it out to you. But that doesn't necessarily equate to all of the energy and effort that goes into memorizing mutun. And so that's why I'm not really a fan of this method of mutun, because it preoccupies the student, exhausts a lot of his energy, so that he's not able to engage in the deep contemplation, analysis, and investigation of what he's reading.
So this is actually a beautiful point, because I'll be honest with you. I think every one of us had a similar kind of unfortunately direction, where we were told, here, go through Bayquniyah, then go through Nukhba and its Sharh al-Nuzha, and then go through Alfiyat al-ʿAwnī. And then there's a great war between which one should you study. Should you do Suyuti, which is focused on this aspect, or you should do Iraqi? And then after that, okay, if anyone gets to Tadrib al-Rawi, and then you get to Al-Hakim's book in Ibn Kathir. So all of these, it goes from, rather than focusing on the conceptualization, which you said, the rational underpinning of why and the methodology of how this science was actually, set. What were the reasonings behind them? Why are there 5 conditions for Sahih? What is the difference between Hasan and Sahih? What are the interpinings, which was one of the greatest, in fact, Sh.Ḥātim is one of his greatest books on the idea of Hasan, right? So it takes away from a student's actual brain power in focusing on the foundational concepts of Hadith sciences, and busies them with this almost monotonous rote memorization, which at the end of the day, I to this day remember the beginnings of Bayquniyah, and it's if you think about what is the concept of it, it's not there. So I mean, what would you say to people who keep insisting on this method rather than understanding the concepts behind it?
Good luck. No. The thing is, in practical terms, time is limited.
Right.
And for many of us as Western students, time is even more limited, because we're starting at a later stage in our life.
Right.
We're taking a couple of years just to learn the Arabic language, and then you want to say, memorize a matan.
Right.
Memorizing a matan is time consuming. It takes a good bit of energy. And when you memorize a matan, typically you're engaging with the information and the concepts that are in this matan at a superficial level, because you spend so much time just on memorizing it, and then deciphering it.
Right.
And so you, even if you move through a lot of information and a lot of mutun in different sciences, oftentimes what will happen is that you will have covered a lot of information, but you'll have only understood it superficially, in relative and varying degrees. But generally speaking, this will be because you will have only engaged the topics that you're dealing with in a superficial fashion.
Because you haven't read into the concepts of those topics in other works which are important. You're actually only focused on the explanations of this particular text.
And someone might actually have enough time to do all of that, and then to read deeply and think deeply and contemplate deeply.
Right.
But the reality is that, why are you doing all of that? You're basically making more work for yourself.
Right.
The fact that there are scholars who do that and then achieve this high level of understanding, not denying that people memorize mutun and then achieve a high level understanding, they're the exception, not the rule.
Right.
Meaning, some people are just brilliant.
Right.
Some people have a whole lot of time and they dedicate all of that time.
Right.
But in terms of efficiency efficiency in terms of using your study time that you have is just not an efficient method. It really comes down to that. It's just not an efficient method.
Great. So this segues on to our last portion, which is Legacy Institute is starting, alhamdulillah, our teaching of the Hadith Sciences. Alhamdulillah, you have a set of books that you're going to, inshallah, be teaching, starting out with Sharḥ Al-Mūqiẓah by Imām Al-Dhahabī, rahimahullah, which is a foundational text in the Hadith Sciences, and Al-Usus Al-ዐqliyyah Manhaj Naqd Hadith, or Manhaj Naqd Sunnah Nabawiyyah by Sh.Ḥātim, more explanations of Sh.Ḥātim Al-ʿAwnī. Before you start on what the syllabus is actually with Legacy Institute, can you tell us just a brief amount about Sh.Ḥātim Al-ʿAwnī, your teacher, as well as what is the program, inshallah, for Legacy Institute, and then I'll end it with why are these two books important to start with? So go ahead, Bismillah.
Okay. Shaykh Ḥātim is someone who, in this period that I mentioned, when I started doing all this reading, I stumbled across a number of his books. And basically in this process that I was in, where I was trying to get to the bottom of answering certain fundamental questions that I had about these issues, I found that Shaykh Ḥātim, in his writings and his lessons, really embodied the sort of standard of scholarship and understanding and engagement with these issues, on a deep intellectual level that I was looking for. And so I started from that stage, benefiting from him tremendously, reading his books and listening to his durus. For example, he has a sharh of the Muqaddimah of Ibn Salah, or the Kitab of Ibn Salah, which is not titled Al-Muqaddimah, as some people have a misconception. But he did a sharh of Ibn Salah in about 110 lessons, extreme detail, and a very meticulous, very detailed research of each and every issue that he's dealing with. This sharh has been transcribed, and he's gone over parts of it, and he has some students who have also helped him go over some parts of it, and work is ongoing to actually ongoing to publish it. I have no idea how big it will be when it's published. Obviously, size of the volumes depends a lot on how many pages are in every volume and font sizes and things like that. But I expect it would be anywhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 8 volumes. Very detailed, very thorough work. And having listened to the sharh, having listened to the durus, the audio sharh, I can say safely that it would be one of the most important and most comprehensive works in the field ever written when it is published. And hopefully in the next year, maybe maximum 2 years, it should be out. It's a really remarkable work. Incredible amount of research went into it. I'm not claiming that Shaykh Ḥātim is alone in this in terms of excellence in hadith research, but certainly he is one scholar who really stands out for the excellence and the scope and depth of the research that he's done and the scholarship that he has produced and continues to produce, primarily in the Hadith Sciences and in other sciences as well. Later on when I came here to Makkah, I think it's been 7 years now, 8 years, I got to know Shaykh Ḥātim and become very close to him and study with him personally, in addition to having heard all of his old durus and read his books and continued reading his books. No, I've been about 11, 12 years here in Makkah, but I think in terms of the amount of time that I've had a close sort of direct relationship with Shaykh Ḥātim, well, even before that, I'd attended some durus with him. But in terms of a sort of personal relationship, that goes back, I think it's been 8 years now. I'm not sure the exact number, but and incidentally, in that time, I've studied with him other things as well. I mean, he actually taught me Not just me. I did a dars with him. Usul al-Fiqh, did al-Mustasfa al-Ghazali, most of it. Read al-Ghiyathi of Imam al-Haramain al-Juwayni. Some other things. And so I've managed to benefit from him tremendously on a personal level in Usul al-Fiqh, in Ḥadīth Sciences, and in other things. And I can honestly say that of all the teachers that I've had inside the university and outside the university, and incidentally, Sh.Ḥātim has taught me inside the university and outside the university. Without a doubt, the one that has had the biggest impact on me and from whom I've benefited the most is Sh.Ḥātim. If I had to name a second person who I've benefited from and say that this is the second most that I've benefited from anyone, it would be Sheikh Musaid al-Tayyab. But even then, the gap in terms of the amount that I've benefited from him, the personal access to him, the depth that that he's gone in so many things that he's researched and written about. I mean, the benefit that I've had from Sheikh Ḥātim is tremendous, and he is now someone who, for those of the listeners who don't know him, in academic circles is pretty much universally recognized as one of the major authorities in the Hadith sciences in our time. And I think it's safe to say that his reputation is such that that this is pretty much accepted by everyone who's in authority, everyone who's familiar with the Hadith sciences. So he has a number of important works that he's written. Some of them are very unique works. One of them is Al-Usus Al-ʿaqliyyah. Al-Usus Al-aqliyyah is a very unique work in that.
With legacy.
Sorry?
This is what we're going to be teaching with legacy, inshallah.
This is the book that is one of the courses that we're going to be doing. Al-Usus Al-aqliyyah is an attempt to lay out and assess the rational foundations on which the Hadith sciences were built, to ascertain, is it genuinely a sound foundation or not. This is a very unique work, and as I mentioned before, it's part of a series. The second work in the series is also out in the future. I'm intending that, inshallah, that second work we will teach as well. The remaining works, if they're published, inshallah, we will teach those as well. Because once you have a framework to understand the fundamentals of science, and this goes for the sciences, Hadith sciences, and any other science, it will help you tremendously in understanding and contextualizing even the most difficult issues that come up that you're faced with in that science. Why? Because you're able to figure out where they fit in the framework. And so this work, as well as other works of Sheikh Ḥātim, are tremendously beneficial in developing that framework with the sciences. So one work with it we'll be going through is Al-Usus Al-aqliyyah, which is just described. And the other work is Sheikh Ḥātim's Sharḥ of Al-Mūqiẓah, which is a manual by Imām Al-Dhahabī with his own comments and views summarized. Right, this was Al-Usus Al-aqliyyah. Summarized and basically Ibn Salah's book, Ma'rifat Anwa' Ulum al-Hadith, is one of the pillars of this science. It's an absolute must read. Every serious scholar, every serious talib al-ilm really ought to study at least to the level of Ibn Salah and have read and understood Ibn Salah very well, or one of its commentaries or derivative works. But ideally Ibn Salah, because his is the work that these other works are based on. And so obviously when you have a scholar who others are based on, it's always better to go to the primary source, right, generally speaking, to understand the ideas as they're developing at the hands of the one who is developing them. Not that everything is being developed by Ibn Salah, but he's really when he wrote this work, he was synthesizing a very broad tradition and many different works and sort of distilling them into a single work. And that is why his work is so pivotal. And that is why those who came after him in the Hadith sciences, their work, their writings tend to revolve around his work, either writing commentaries, critiquing his opinions, summarizing his book, writing commentaries on those summaries, etc. So everything sort of goes back to Ibn Salah. Al-Mūqiẓah is based on one of the Mukhtasarat of Ibn Salah by a scholar called, a famous scholar, great Imam, called Ibn Daqiq al-Eid. Imām Al-Dhahabī, who was a student of Ibn Daqiq al-Eid, Ibn Daqiq al-Eid is one of his shuyukh. He summarized it in Al-Mūqiẓah, adding his own thoughts. Obviously, Imām Al-Dhahabī is, of the middle centuries of Islam, arguably the greatest scholar of Hadith criticism, Rijal criticism. And if he's not the greatest, he's certainly one of them. And I think it's hard for anyone to claim that anyone from the middle centuries of Islam, from around the period that he was in, anyone was greater than him. He has written a unique manual which has a number of unique observations, a number of unique treatments of important issues that you won't find in other manuals. This is one of the things that makes his book Al-Mūqiẓah very important. Sh.Ḥātim's Sharh is extremely beneficial because he doesn't go into an extreme amount of depth. The Sharh is fairly short in terms of actual length and the amount of detail that he covers every issue in. But one of the things that makes his Sharh uniquely beneficial as a textbook to be studied is that there are a number of difficult issues in this Hadith sciences, which basically the most salient points in terms of his conclusions on those issues, he has presented them in a very clear, very accessible, and at the same time, I would say profound fashion in this Sharh. So it's in that sense, it's a unique and excellent manual for the Hadith sciences. And since it's been published, it's gone through many prints. It's a very popular work. A number of scholars in different countries across the Muslim world actually teach this. Some of them have made it a textbook in some of their institutes. This is in spite of the fact that typically the works that are studied will often be classical works, but because of the importance and value of his work, this is one that is very popular amongst Tulab al-Ilm, very popular amongst teachers. I personally have read it, studied it, and I would even say have taught parts of it. So it's an excellent work to lay the foundation, because this other aspect that I mentioned about Sheikh Ḥātim's clear understanding about the need for an intellectual framework that brings together all the different aspects of the Hadith sciences in a holistic fashion. This quality, it influences the way that he is presenting, even though it's a short work. It influences the way that he is treating the topics, and so it's an excellent stepping stone to then move on to studying one of the very fundamental works like the book of Ibn Salah, which inshallah I'm planning that at some point, maybe not either immediately after Al-Mūqiẓah or not long after Al-Mūqiẓah, maybe with some other courses in between, that inshallah maybe within the course of the next year or so, that we will begin a course on the book of Ibn Salah. So this is a valuable stepping stone to get a foundation on the way to studying the pivotal book of Ibn Salah, which inshallah, when we get to that, I will obviously also be having gone through the Sharh of Ḥātim, will also be drawing heavily on his Sharh with that. Inshallah, one day, if in the next year or two, his Sharh of Ibn Salah is published, we will have a course on that.
Okay, so great. So we're starting out, inshallah, with Legacy Institute on our Hadith Sciences, I think, section by Sharḥ Al-Mūqiẓah, which Sheikh Salman is going to be teaching alongside the book by Sheikh Ḥātim of Al-Usus Al-ʿaqliyyah, which is the rational foundations of hadith criticism. We're going to have, inshallah, after that, a number of courses as well, and the underpinnings of the philosophy of hadith sciences as well as hadith criticism, and working from Al-Mūqiẓah, inshallah, to Ibn Salah, possibly more texts, foundational texts after Al-Dhahabī, working our way to Ibn Salah, inshallah, and then eventually to Sh.Ḥātim Al-ʿAwnī's Sharḥ, or his explanation of Ibn Salah in general. Is there anything else that you had in mind to say as a concluding remark before we start taking some very good questions?
I think we move to the questions. We'll move to the questions, take the questions, and then wrap up.
All right, inshallah. Jazakallah khair. So the first question that we had, some of them are specific regarding the actual aspect of hadith, so I'll save them towards the end. There is a question here by Sayyid Abdullah ibn Mas'ud. Apparently, this specific course will not equip us with the tools that Sheikh Salman is explaining. So, would there be any advanced courses? And again, I think this was early in the session, so we answered this this question in the later part. But the question on advanced courses in hadith studies.
Right. Inshallah, the intent is to thoroughly cover the foundational hadith sciences, such that basically the level of mastery that I mentioned, that someone needs to have all of the essential tools such that they can come back and access and investigate any issue when it arises. Our goal is to actually, through a series of various courses, which these were the first two, and they're the first stepping stone. The goal is to actually get to that point. The goal is to get to that point. And so classes such as Sharh of Ibn Salah's book will actually serve that purpose.
So we're starting out from the foundational works, and we're going to get to these to the level.
We're going to build up to the more advanced works, as well as having courses on certain other important topics such as Tadween al-Hadith, just sort of understanding the history of how the Hadith was reported. Right, the history of how the Hadith was reported. Al-Jarh wa Ta'dil, maybe a dedicated course on Jarh wa Ta'dil, Takhrij, Ilm al-Ilal. Some of that is still, needs some thought and development, but inshallah we're working on trying to cover all of these things in such a fashion that by the time these courses are done, the student will have a solid foundation on which, basically, at that point, if he wants to be a specialist, then it's up to him. Basically, the last thing that I didn't mention was, if somebody actually wants to be a specialist, if you want to be a specialist in Hadith, you do all of that, you learn all those fundamentals, then you read everything. But that's what it means to be a specialist. And that's why I'm not a specialist.
Muhammad asked, what level to start both these books? I don't know Arabic.
These courses that we're doing are going to be reading Arabic texts. Right. In the future, we will have some courses that will be delivered in English medium, strictly in English medium. The material and what have you for English medium, for more general audience. But for these courses, at least having some degree of confidence and fluency in reading Arabic is a must.
Great. So this also leads us that Sheikh Salman will have a foundational hadith class for the scholastically literate or literacy for people who don't know Arabic. That will come later, inshallah ta'ala, and we'll have that for legacy, inshallah. There's some specific questions here. I don't know if you'd like to answer them, but this question by Imam is, will the class cover issues and instances where ulama like Al-Dhahabī have authenticated hadith in terms of its sanad, but has still rejected it based on the matan?
I don't know if we will deal specifically with in depth with the idea of matan criticism, but certainly matan criticism is an integral part of the study of the hadith sciences. So at some point we will get to that. Maybe even at some point we might have some sort of dedicated course for advanced students, if there is if Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us life and tawfiq to do so. If there are, in fact, students who are interested in such a thing at an advanced level, perhaps we could even have a course dealing with Matan criticism. So this is something that will come up in some fashion or another. But I mean, I can't speak in that sort of detail right now.
Great. Okay. And I think that's the last question with regards to this. First of all, jazakumullah khair to everybody, inshallah, for joining us. For those of you who would like to sign up, again, that's legacy.institute/academy. You have an option of taking just Sharḥ Al-Mūqiẓah by Al-Dhahabī or Al-Usus Al-ʿAqliyyah separately, or we have obviously an option for you to take both, and they're at a special early bird price until September 12th. We will give you, inshallah, the details again at the link that you see on the banner below you. And we, inshallah, hope that this will be a start to anyone who's actually interested in, again, the whole point and purpose is to give a foundation from beginning until, inshallah, they have a complete foundation of the hadith sciences, starting with foundational hadith and the rational underpinnings and understanding of what makes hadith sciences and hadith criticism. These are what the two classes are mainly about. Again, the prerequisite is for you to at least know Arabic. So because these texts are in Arabic, for those interested in English, we will have something later on, inshallah. Jazakumullah khair for everyone joining. Jazakumullah khair for Sheikh Salman for joining us and sharing with us his journey. وآخر دعوانا أن الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. And we will see you all inshallah ta'ala in the next discussion. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.